Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Seat of wisdom.
Pray for us.
Saint Thomas Aquinas.
Pray for us.
Saint John Bosco.
Pray for us.
Saint Richard Gwyn.
Pray for us.
Saint Philip Neri.
Pray for us.
The Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. Right. So this is part 1A. There's a part 1B, a part 1C, and a part 2, which we might not get to. Part 1A then, if you want to go to the first slide, please.
Yeah. Why is it not? Oh, there we are.
All right. This is where we begin, and this I unashamedly have pinched from lots and lots of different presentations given by Kent Hovind. If you don't know him, it's worth watching him, particularly between the years of about 2000, 2001 and 2006. He used to go all over the United States to universities debating the professors of geology, anthropology, biology and all of this, and ran rings around them. And the most interesting thing about those debates is not just the amazing stuff he comes out with, but really how poor quality his opponents are, even though they have fancy titles. They really don't have any answers at all, they don't have any arguments, and they're very, very poor public speakers as well. Most of his presentations he begins in this way, and I think for a very good reason, because a lot of evolution is just the teaching of what we think of as evolution is a sleight of hand. So here's what you're being expected to believe in. Unless you're a backwards, right-wing fundamentalist, inbred, Southern Baptist creationist, this is what you believe in. Cosmic evolution, chemical evolution, stellar evolution, organic evolution, macroevolution, and microevolution, which I put quotation marks around it because it really has nothing to do with evolution. It shouldn't be in there, and that's part of the sleight of hand. Now, cosmic evolution, where did everything come from, and particularly matter? If there was once a time where there was nothing at all, and then suddenly there is something, that's a pretty big change. Where did stuff come from? And you can't just say the Big Bang, because what was it that went bang? Also, where did the laws come from that govern explosions and things going bang? That already had to have existed, or you can't have a Big Bang. Also, big doesn't make any sense because big is relative to small, so you have to have dimensions. Where did they come from? So there was a time before any of that existed, and in fact you have three things that need to exist, and they need to exist simultaneously. You have matter needs to come into existence. So did that spontaneously come into existence? That's what we're expected to believe. Space, dimensions had to simultaneously exist. You can't have matter without having dimensions, or where do you put it? And time has to exist, because if you have matter and space but no time, when do you put it? So matter, time and space have to coexist, and they all have to spontaneously start to exist, and we're expected to just believe that. Cosmic evolution. Chemical evolution, essentially you have a periodic table with all of these elements. Where did that come from? Did they all evolve from hydrogen? How do you get uranium out of hydrogen? And like cosmic evolution, it's really not dealt with, it's just glossed over. This just sort of happened. It happened in the Big Bang, okay, don't ask too many questions, moving swiftly on. But then you stop and think about it, it really is an insurmountable problem. Where did it come from? Where are all those elements from? You can't say they all came about through fusion, because you can't get an entire periodic table coming from just hydrogen. So you need to have chemical evolution, and again, like cosmic evolution, it needs to happen right at the start before anything else can happen. Stellar evolution is the stars, but also the planets. Where did they come from? Or the stars formed because bits of stuff stuck together and then it just started burning. Well, there's a number of problems with that. Oh, fusion creates stars, but stars are where fusion happens, so there's a chicken and egg problem there. Also, bits of matter sticking together when they bang into each other happens on a very, very small level. Bits of dust stick together, maybe, perhaps. But if you get two rocks and bang them together, it's the other way around. Beyond a very, very low, there's quite a low threshold where beyond a certain size, it has the opposite effect. But what we're being asked to believe is, where did the planets come from? just stuff kind of stuck together and made a bigger and bigger thing, and eventually it was a planet. Something along those lines. Doesn't make any sense, defies all the laws of physics, and we're not seeing it today. You don't get two planets forming an even bigger mega planet. That just doesn't happen. Also, with all the stars that are out there, we don't really see stars being formed. We see stars dying all the time. We see nova and supernova, and there are quadrillions of stars out there that exist, and that's a fact. And yet, we see them dying, but we don't see any new ones being created. Now, that's a simple mathematical problem there. You've got a certain number, and if they have a certain lifespan, the input has to at least equal the output. Does that make sense? You have to have as many people, it's like a population of human beings. There's as many people being born as there are dying if you want the population to stay the same. So there's a huge population of stars. We don't see any stars being born, we see lots of them dying. So where do they all come from? And we've never actually witnessed a star being born. They will say, oh, we saw that star being born. The problem with that is you're not really observing it, you're observing it at a very, very long distance, so all you really see is a tiny amount of light, and you see that amount of light getting brighter, but we don't know if maybe there was a dust cloud in front that cleared or something like that. So the assumption, they'll make assumptions and they'll say, oh, this star was born. We don't know that. Also, by the way, we don't really know how far away they are. That is there's a lot of trickery going on in that, and I can say more about it later on if you remind me, because they use parallax trigonometry, which is just utter nonsense. You can't do that. You just can't do that. That's supposedly how we know how far stars are away. Billions of light years away. You can't use trigonometry to calculate billions of miles, or how light or how intense the light is how they use to calculate how far something away is, which again is nonsense. Right, organic evolution. So these stars and planets just sort of spontaneously formed out of this big bang. There was nothing exploded and made everything. So there was nothing. Space, time and matter spontaneously began to exist. The laws of physics governing things going bang and so forth spontaneously began to exist. They sort of evolved themselves from nothing to existing, I guess. And then everything went bang, and then there was matter. By the way, there's not enough matter or energy in the universe, and by a factor of something like 10, they reckon there's about 10% of what there needs to be for the Big Bang to be true. So they call the remaining, whatever's missing, 80-90% dark matter and dark energy, which is just laughably fiction. It's science fiction. Dark means it doesn't exist. Dark means there's no evidence for it existing, but our calculations don't add up. It's like having a big deficit in your bank account and telling your bank manager that the remaining £500,000, the remaining 500 million of investors' money, well, it's dark money, yes? FTX. It's dark. It's there, you just can't see it. Okay? Otherwise things don't add up. Yeah, and so the Earth was one of these. The Sun presumably came about somehow. Lots of hydrogen spontaneously got itself together and started combusting, and there's the Sun. No explanation for how that happens, and we've never observed it. But it must have happened, because otherwise we need to believe that somebody created it. And the Earth was this fiery molten rock, and then it cooled down and it rained on the rocks for millions of years. Kent Hovind. It rained on the rocks for millions of years, and it turned them into soup, and the soup came alive. That's basically it. That's what he said. But he's right. He's right. Prebiotic soup, from which life started. You can't put water and rock and get life out of it. If you have inorganic material, non-living material, how do you get living material out of non-living material? And the sleight of hand that goes on there, and it applies to a lot of these other things, is, oh, it happened over billions of years. Well, the science of logic tells you that if something doesn't happen, waiting a very, very, very long time doesn't help you. It still won't happen. Alchemy doesn't work. You can't turn lead into gold. Well, maybe if we wait 4.65 billion years, the lead will turn into gold. It still won't happen. So where did actual living cells come from? There's an experiment I'll come to maybe later on called the Miller-Urey experiment, where they tried to prove that. It was done in the 1950s. Reports of it are massively exaggerated. It really didn't work. All it showed is just how many problems had to be overcome. And it's never been repeated since. In fact, every time they've tried to repeat it, they just encounter even more problems than they realised the first time. So you can't get living matter from non-living matter, that's just how it is. Okay? And then macroevolution is where living things turn into other living things. So if we're being scientific about this, you have to say, well, have we ever seen from a population of dogs anything other than a dog being produced? No, we haven't. Okay, well then you can't really start saying that the amoeba turned into a fish, the fish grew legs and walked on the land, and then it turned into a reptile, which then grew wings and turned into a bird and all the rest of it. There's some evolution textbooks out there teach that the whale used to be a cow because it has a pelvis, which is nonsense. I mean, it has a pelvis, but because muscles need to attach to it. But the cow walked into the water and turned into a whale. How did that happen? Did the cow grow a blowhole in the top of its head? It makes no sense at all. So macroevolution is what most people think of when they think evolution. Monkeys turning into human beings. Oh, you don't understand it at all. It's not monkeys that turn into human beings. It's monkeys had the same ancestor as human beings. Well, okay, how is that significantly different to monkeys turning into human beings? And microevolution. What's meant by microevolution is variation within a kind, which is to say we understand more now that we understand genetics, but I think people already understood this. Dogs are the best example because a lot of breeds of dogs, maybe even most breeds of dogs, I don't know, are man-made. And so you have a big gene pool within dogs, okay? And you select part of that gene pool you're breeding for, let's say, size. The Chihuahua is a great example because it's so teeny tiny, it's minuscule, it's a completely man-made dog, it's useless. It wouldn't survive 5 minutes in the wild and it serves no useful purpose, it's like a little toy, that's it. Okay, but how did we get there? Somebody over the years took the smallest and bred them and took the smallest of those and bred them. So you're selecting a slice for smallness. That's all you're selecting for. It's a man-made selection for smallness until you get a dog that's very small. Or a dog that's very big, like a Great Dane. Or a dog that's very fast, like a greyhound. But in fact, by the time you reach there, you're swimming in the shallow end of the gene pool. You don't have as much genetic information. And in fact, what you find is, with animals like that, they have all sorts of other problems. Greyhounds are very fast, but they have problems with their joints, they don't live as long, they're not as resistant, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so microevolution is just variation within a kind. I'll give you another example. If you, let's say you had a population of dogs, and you let's say you're a dog breeder, you have a large population, and you move, I don't know, somewhere very warm and sunny, let's say the Sahara Desert. What probably would happen is the dogs with long hair wouldn't do so well, and the dogs with short hair would thrive, okay? And so before long you'd have a population of short-haired dogs. But if you were to go and live in the North Pole, Greenland or somewhere like that, it would be the other way around. You'd expect the ones with long hair to do really well and the short-haired ones not to do so well because it's very cold. But the long hair and short hair are both present in the gene pool, okay? So you're just taking something that's already there. That's microevolution, and I think evolution, it's not really evolution at all, it's variation within that kind of animal, within the gene pool. And it has nothing at all to do with these other 5 things. Why is it there? Because very often in the textbook and in biology lessons and in the popular media as well, microevolution will be the one which people, they can give tons of examples of this and they'll say, see, that proves that it's true. And so it's a sleight of hand. They get you to, this obviously is happening, therefore the other things are happening as well. Okay, and unless you've really stopped and thought about it, it's very difficult off the top of your head to say, hold on a minute, there's something essentially different between variation within a kind. Getting long-haired and short-haired dogs, if you breed dogs enough, will they eventually turn into a horse? And that's what's being suggested. Okay? Alright, so this is scientific, but it's just not evolution. These other 3 are purely fictional. They're a little better than a religion, really. But that's what we're being asked to believe. That makes sense so far? Okay, alright, let's go on. Next slide. I won't spend so long on all the other ones. So the first thing I want to do then is just hammer this point that evolution is not scientific. It's not a part of science, and it has no business being taught in any science lesson, in any biology lesson. David Cameron, I think, in 2014 passed a law in this country making it illegal for creationism or creation or a creator or anything like that to be taught in schools as part of a science lesson. If I were to do this in a school, as long as it's not on the timetable as science, I wouldn't be technically breaking the law. But that shows where we're at, really. But it's not scientific. Those are the two. I think Merriam-Webster is very popular in America, and the Oxford English Dictionary. I've highlighted the bits. Notice it's about data, observation, experiment and testing. These are the physical sciences, and I think already we took a wrong turn a few hundred years ago by assuming that a thing has to be measurable in order to exist. But when we're talking about the physical sciences, that's generally what is accepted. Okay, so with evolution, if in order to be scientific, it has to be observable. Have we ever observed two animals breeding and producing a different animal? We never have. It's never been observed. Okay, it's not measurable. What's the experiment that demonstrates evolution? There isn't one. There isn't one. There's no experiment that demonstrates the Big Bang. There's no experiment that demonstrates macroevolution. So it's not scientific. And yeah, when you're talking about the physical sciences, that it presupposes something that's there in front of you now that you can test and experiment. What we're talking about here is the past. The past no longer exists. The past isn't here. Okay? You can crush up bits of rock and put it in a test tube and run various tests on it, but that's rock that exists right now in front of us. The past no longer exists. So they've mixed two things together. They're talking about the past and they're calling it science, but it isn't. It doesn't fit their own definition of it. Okay? All right, let's go on, please. Right. There we go. Those are my questions then. When has evolution ever been observed and by whom? What is the experiment which demonstrates evolution? By what means has the hypothesis of evolution ever been tested? And by, if it's not falsifiable, then I mean it's not a fair playing field really, because you have to accept it. They've never proved it, so you can't disprove it. Well, you can, but you understand what I'm saying. When and by what means has evolution ever been measured? How do we measure it? We can't measure it. Does the past exist, and can it be the object of a physical science? I would arguably say the answer is no. And finally, special pleading aside, is it therefore fair or honest for the scientific community, quote unquote, to present this to the uneducated masses as being no different to any other science? You'll notice that the mainstream media is very fond of saying scientists say, and that's it, you're just meant to take their word for them. It's like a modern magisterium. But the fascinating thing is, intramurally, among themselves, in these various journals that nobody really reads, they admit, I've got a clue. But when they talk to the outside world, they go, oh, yes, of course, we know everything. Yeah. It's not the same as any others. I'm sorry, it's not science. It's simple as that. You notice the debate is always couched in terms of religion versus science, faith versus science, and we mustn't engage in that. That's fighting the battle on the enemy's ground that they have picked. The minute we go into that, we've already lost, we've already accepted something that isn't really true. It's not religion versus science. It's arguably religion versus religion, because evolution is a religion, it's a religious worldview, but also it's good science versus fake science. This is fake science. And if you are going to be strictly scientific, you have to throw all of this out. So I think that has to be the starting point of any debate. Not religion versus science, but first of all, is evolution science? No, it's not. Let's go on. Next slide, please. Right, how old is the Earth then? This shouldn't, strictly speaking, be something important, because, as I've said before, if something doesn't happen over a year or two, then it won't happen over millions of years. However, they say it takes millions of years, and in the popular mind, that is what explains it. Most people, I would say virtually all people, if you said an amoeba turned into a fish, turned into a lizard, turned into a bird or whatever, if you said this happened over the course of 6 months, they'd say nonsense, get away. Okay? The princess kissed the frog and the frog turned into a prince. A primary school child knows that's a fairy tale and it doesn't really happen in real life. Ah, but what if we waited billions of years? Maybe then the frog would turn into a prince. Most people believe it because of the billions of years, which is magic dust that makes the impossible happen. Why? Because the mind boggles. You can't possibly begin to imagine billions of years. You can't really even imagine a million years, to be honest. Try and picture a million years in your mind. You just can't, can you? I mean, I teach about the ancient Greeks 2,500 years ago. That's a long old time ago. That's a long time. And I can almost not picture how long that is in terms of decades and centuries and so on. But a lot of people would say, oh, that's nothing at all, because they're used to thinking in terms of billions of years. But in fact, it is a long time. 2,500 years is a long time. I mean, it's just scrambled our concept of time. And it's also, it's the cover by which all of these fallacies can slip through, because if it's a long time, it must maybe be true. Let's go on, please. All right. These, I think, are the main proofs, then, for how old the Earth is. If you can prove scientifically, first of all, evolution isn't science, but secondly, that the Earth is very young, you're going to cut off the error at its source. First of all, evolution can't happen. Well, it can't happen anyway, but even they will admit that it can't happen within a short time frame. Secondly, we don't have to deal with all this nonsense about theistic evolution and maybe God did it, but he used evolution or whatever. No. Stop. None of that is true, because the Earth is very young. Right, how do they prove that the Earth is old? The geological column, they use that to prove the age of the Earth. Fossils, they use that to prove the age of the Earth. And radiometric dating. Those are the main three, I would think. Okay? And there we go. There's the geological column then. This is what it's supposed to look like. That's from a University of Michigan textbook. I just did a Google search. But pretty much any textbook that deals with it looks something like that. Okay? Points to note, lots of different names of all the different eras, and then different fossils. These are called index fossils. That's how you tell what era it is. In fact, you'll be surprised to hear that the different layers of rock don't come in different colours like that, but quite a lot of them are limestone. Which is why you need index fossils, because if you were to hand a piece of limestone to a geologist and say to him, is this 100 million year old Jurassic limestone or 500, 600 million year old Cambrian limestone, he can't tell because it's limestone. He'll say, well, what fossils were found in it? That's how they tell how old it is, supposedly. But it's, again, various people have said this. Kent Hovind always says this, something like 80%, 85% of the Earth's surface that we know of doesn't contain 3 of these layers in the right order. And in fact, the only place where all of these layers exist in that order is in a textbook. Out there, this just doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. So it's already a bit of a myth. Okay? But this is how they get their, well, it's one of the ways that they get their millions and billions of years. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, there we go. So first of all, we're asked to believe that each of these layers are laid down over millions of years each, and therefore when you see the thing, it's billions of years old. But there are plenty of places, these are 2 that I just came across, again from a quick search on the internet, were all of those layers laid down over millions of years each? Or were they all laid down in one go as mud in some kind of big flood, and then before they hardened into rock, they were folded back on each other? Which of the 2 does that suggest? Does that suggest a long time period, billions of years, millions between each layer, or does it suggest all in one go with a lot of force in a big cataclysmic flood? I just don't see a way around that. Did the layers fall upwards as they got added to it? It doesn't work, does it? Same thing with this. You see this, there's quite a few different places where you see layers that do all sorts of things. They go sideways, they go right back on top of each other. Charles Darwin, incidentally, this is what got him going on evolution when he went on his voyage on the Beagle. He says, and he's writing about it afterwards, and I don't know how much he's romanticised his own biography, but he says that when he set sail on the Beagle, he believed in God and the Bible and so on. He was a Protestant, but anyway, he went on the Beagle in, I think, 1836, was it? And he took with him some books to read. By the way, he was a complete loser. He didn't have a job, he couldn't hold down a job, and I think his father pulled strings for him and got him this job on the Beagle, which was unpaid. it just provided board and lodging. But I mean, imagine it was a sloop. It's quite a small ship. Board and lodging on board a ship like that is a teeny cramped cabin and horrible food in those days, like meat that was going off and very salty and biscuits with weevils in them. But at least it kept him occupied for a year. One of the books that he took with him was Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology, and Charles Lyell himself was using the work of James Hutton from the late 1700s, and both of them they claimed to be theists, but the term atheist didn't exist back then. Nobody claimed to be an atheist back then. If you were a theist, that's 1800 talk for being an atheist. Okay, you don't believe. It means, I concede maybe that God exists, but that's it. There's no Bible, there's no religion, there's no nothing. It's basically the equivalent of being an atheist today. And Lyell, in his book Principles of Geology, openly says that his task is to free science from Moses. In other words, prove to everybody that the Bible is wrong. And that's the book that Darwin read. And he says that that is what made him lose his belief in God. So he starts with this. The layers of rock are millions of years old each, and they were formed over a very long period of time, using what's known as uniformitarianism. Uniformitarianism really means the assumption that when you see something happening slowly today, it must have always been happening slowly. Okay? Lyell, I think, went to France. He went to the Auvergne, which is a very remote region in central France, and he went to this gorge, this valley gorge with a little river in the bottom of it, and observed, the river is depositing sediment at a rate of, I don't know, half an inch a year, say, something like that. And the sides of the gorge are like half a mile deep, therefore it must have taken millions of years, etc. Well, it's a faulty assumption, because you don't know that it's always been happening at the same rate. What if there was a big cataclysmic event that changed everything in one go? Okay? Next slide, please. Okay, polystrate fossils. These are fossils that run through lots and lots and lots of different layers. They're tree trunks. Supposedly, each of these layers is millions of years old. Okay, polystrate just means lots of different layers. It's a many-layered fossil, is what that means. And the tree trunks, sometimes they're upside down. Very often they have no leaves, no branches, no roots, usually. But the point is, they're all vertical. Now, you would expect, if this were a long, millions of years each layer process, that they should be lying down sideways. Because when that tree first was inserted into the layers, why didn't it fall over? Why didn't it rot away? You're telling me it stood upright for millions of years with all the elements, it didn't rot away, getting rained on and all the rest of it, and it didn't fall over. How do you explain that? I have yet to see an explanation from a millions of years, billions of years geologist. By the way, most geologists are billions of years because you don't get a job otherwise. That's basically how it works. But these aren't rare things. They're all over the place, all over the world. Joggins, I think I've got that wrong. It's not Pennsylvania, USA. It's Nova Scotia, Canada. There's another place in Pennsylvania called Specimen Ridge, where they've just got these layers and they've got loads of fossils and lots of polystrate fossils in there. This is, I forget where from. Next, please. Tennessee. You can see here there's a layer of coal. This happens quite a lot. Lots of different layers, and the fossil will become whatever that layer is. So you'll get a tree trunk running through. One of those layers will be coal, and the tree trunk will have turned into coal during that time. And we're told the coal and oil take millions of years to form. No, they don't. That can happen very easily. What's required is pressure, not time. This is from France. Same thing. Each of these layers is millions of years old. Why didn't they fall over? You can't answer it. I think that, if nothing else, polystrate fossils disprove the geological column. If that were the only evidence I could bring, that would be enough. But there is more. Next, please. Okay.
Who invented the layers? Wasn't that Lyell?
Charles Lyell, yes,
Yeah.
I said that already. Charles Lyell is the Principles of Geology. He's the one who came up with. But really, James Hutton, who was a Scotsman, was the first one. Yeah. Okay. As evidence, what does their presence suggest? This is it. If you're being scientific, you have to look at the evidence and say, were those layers all deposited in one go or very slowly over time? And the only answer is they were all deposited in one go, and that suggests a big cataclysmic event such as a flood. And because they're found all over the world, that would have to be a worldwide flood. But because that's in the Bible, it's automatically ruled out of court. Now, which is totally illogical if you think about it. It shouldn't matter whether it's in the Bible or not. Okay? If there's evidence for a flood, then there's evidence for a flood. Whether the Bible happens to say that as well or not. By the way, it's not just the Bible that talks about a worldwide flood. Every single culture well, not every single culture, but lots and lots and lots of different cultures in the world, they all have a flood myth. The ancient Greeks had a flood myth. The Hawaiians had a story about how a man called Nubu built the great canoe, and then the gods flooded the world, and he put all the animals on the canoe. You'd be amazed. South America, the Maasai tribes in Kenya have a story about how this chap built a big raft. But the details vary, and how many human beings there were vary, and the name of the chap. But essentially, it's the same story. The Hawaiian flood myth even has the bit about the rainbow at the end. And Hawaii, I mean, they didn't have contact with the Jews. It's in the middle of the Pacific, for goodness sake. But so I think there is evidence for a flood, but I'm getting a little bit off topic. Even if we were to say, okay, we don't know, but it seems to be, I think that's fairly convincing. Right, next slide, please. All right, this is how polystrate fossils are actually formed. This is Mount St. Helens in the very top left corner of the United States, Washington State. There is a volcano which erupted around 1981, not long before I was born. And what happens is, at various points, the trees are uprooted because of the upheaval of the land, and they end up floating here. This is actually a lake with lots of kind of waterlogged tree trunks floating on it sideways. As the tree trunks become more and more waterlogged, they turn 90 degrees, and they end up like this. They end up mostly underwater, like an iceberg, floating near the surface, a little bit sticking out, and eventually they become so waterlogged that they just sink slowly downwards. That's a little bit what you're seeing there. That's the same place, Mount St. Helens. And they sink downwards. Obviously they've lost all of their branches and all their roots. Those are the polystrate fossils that we find. But like Mount St. Helens, you see, there was a huge upheaval in the ground, and lots of layers of sediment deposited all in one go. So Mount St. Helens is a teeny tiny little version of what happened worldwide, the flood. Yeah. Okay. Next slide, please. This I just thought I'd mention in passing. Sedimentology.fr is a chap called Ghiberto, who in the 80s did what everybody else should have done and did actual scientific experiments on how layers are deposited, and he found that they're not even deposited one layer on top of the other. That's not true. In moving water, lots of layers on top of each other get deposited like this, end to end. Okay? So you can have something down here which is later than something up here because it's further along. And he tried it out in the Bay of Naples, and it worked as well. So it's not just in a river. He even, I think, went to the University of Colorado, and they had like a simulated riverbed with a bit like a water park flume going around inside an enormous, massive hangar. And then the experiment has been done again and again and refined since then. And not only is it repeatable, it demonstrates, the more they refine it, it demonstrates it even more clearly. They use big and little particles and medium ones, and some of them are coloured black and some of them are white. So you can easily see what happens to them. And you end up with something like this, different layers being deposited. Just from randomly dumping a load of them mixed in together into water, they will separate themselves out. Next slide, please. Okay, this is Grand Canyon. This is probably the most iconic example of what we're talking about. If you're a tourist there, the signs will tell you it took millions and billions and gorillions of years, and the tour guides will tell you the same thing. It's a huge, great big thing carved out of the landscape, and a teeny little river in the bottom. In fact, it's a pretty big river, the River Colorado, but by comparison with the canyon, it's quite small. Now, what we're told is that the little river, plus a long time, carved out the canyon. The other explanation, though, is that it was a lot of water in a short time that carved it out. Because if there were a worldwide flood, what would happen is the water would run off, but it would get trapped in certain pockets, and it would be like a dam, and eventually the dam bursts, and that's where the canyon gets carved out. And there's a number of different proofs of that. Next slide, please. So here, yeah, that's a sort of map of it. Goes all the way back to where there's 4 states that meet. I think it's Utah, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, something like that. That bit around there is where the water would have backed up and then would burst through the dam. In between the different layers, there are no signs of erosion, which there would have been if they'd been sat there exposed to the elements. You would expect to see erosion marks between each layer. There aren't any, which suggests they were all laid down in one go. Next slide, please. And that's, yeah, here we go. So 4 states. Here's the Grand Canyon in Arizona. If it had burst, the water would have kind of been, this is just imaginary, we don't know exactly where the water would have gone. But this bit up here, if there had been a runoff from the flood and it had been trapped, somewhere behind the Grand Canyon, the water would have backed up until it burst. The other thing is, and I didn't manage to find a sideways elevation, but it's fascinating really, the river enters the canyon at 2,800 feet and it exits the canyon at 1,800 feet. So it drops 1,000 feet as it goes through Grand Canyon. But the middle of Grand Canyon is 7,000 feet high. Now rivers don't flow uphill. If the river carved out Grand Canyon, it would have had to have flowed like that. Because where it enters and where it goes out, the middle is much, much higher. Rivers don't flow uphill. Simple. I mean, I don't really see the answer to that either. I think it's wishful thinking. But it's probably we would know a lot more if people had done serious research into this, but they don't. It's only really creationist organisations which are small and grassroots funded. All the serious scientists think they know all the answers, so they just don't look into it. Right, next slide, please.
Sorry,
Okay.
yes. So what does the river currently do? Does it form?
Oh, it goes along the
top of
bottom. It goes along the bottom.
Oh, okay.
But with very steep sides of the canyon, which allegedly were carved out as the river ate its way down through them. Yes?
Yeah.
But the top of those sides is higher than where it enters.
Right.
Which is why I say it would have had to flow uphill. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no.
Yeah? Okay. Index fossils I mentioned before. This is from the American Journal of Science. The rocks do date the fossils. That's the layers of rock in the geological column. The rocks do date the fossils, but the fossils date the rocks more accurately. Stratigraphy cannot avoid this kind of reasoning if it insists on using only temporal concepts because circularity is inherent in the derivation of timescales. That sounds to me like they are admitting to circular reasoning. We tell you how old the layer of rock is by the fossils we find in it. Well, how do you know how old those fossils are? Because of the layer of rock that we found it in. So we use the layer of rock to date the fossils, and we use the fossils to date the layer of rock. It's circular reasoning, not scientific. The intelligent layman has long suspected circular reasoning in the use of rocks to date fossils and fossils to date rocks. The geologist has never bothered to think of a good reply. I'm not aware of a good reply to that, except I'm a scientist, how dare you... Yeah, that's basically the reply you're going to get. This is from the American Journal of Science, J.E. O'Rourke. Next slide, please. Okay, so how old are fossils? Well, fossils don't normally happen. This is from a textbook, I forget where. The idea is, and this what the same thing here. You see, the animal dies, and then sort of the layers of. The idea is that the Earth, all around us, the ground, is constantly rising very slowly. Because little bits of dust or whatever, like a room that you haven't been in for many years, has a layer of dust in it. Okay, the ground slowly built up, but it takes millions of years. Okay, so when something dies, it eventually gets covered over. And then it fossilises. That's in the textbooks. It's in the textbook of a certain school, which some of you know, which some of you may even have been to, that I won't mention. Because I'm a nosy Parker, whenever I can look inside people's textbooks, I do. And in the A-level biology textbooks, it has a picture of a stegosaurus on its side, gradually being covered over in time. But that doesn't happen. If you hit a cat with your car and it crawls to the side of the road and dies, go back a year later, there'll be nothing left because it will rot away. You'll have scavengers picking the bones clean, and even the skeleton won't remain intact, right? And it certainly won't be a perfectly preserved skeleton. And that doesn't happen to a fish either. That's not how it works. If your goldfish dies because you go on holiday for a year and forget to feed it, you're not going to find a fossilised skeleton in the bottom of the tank. It'll be gone. Okay? If you want to fossilise your goldfish, the way I would go about it is to empty the water out and dump a load of concrete on top of it, and that's it. It will fossilise because the air is trapped. You have a bit of air and a bit of kind of microbes in there that will eat away the flesh, but the skeleton will survive. But it needs to happen immediately, and it needs to happen with a huge amount of force, and it needs to be crushed. That's the important point. It needs to be crushed. So why do we find fossils all over the world, we find evidence of animals that died in a disaster. They got crushed. And a lot of these dinosaurs died with their backs arched. They died in an emergency. They died instantly. Okay? Next slide, please. Okay. I'm going to show you some fossils where I want you to tell me if there is any possible way that these fossils could have died of old age. Or does it absolutely 100% have to be the case that they died instantly in a disaster? Right, let's go. Next slide. There we go. So this is a fish eating another fish, fossilised in the act of swallowing a smaller fish. It died with its dinner half in and half out of its mouth. Did they die of old age, or did that happen instantly? Right, next slide, please. Oh look, there's another fish, fossilised, eating another fish. By the way, do check, these are not the same pictures from different angles. Right? How many fossils can there possibly be of a fish that died in the act of eating another fish? Well, there's 2. Next slide. Oh look, there's a third one. This time it's almost finished eating its dinner. And then it died before it could quite finish. Right, next one. Oh look, there's a 4th one. Right, next slide. Oh, and a 5th one. Right, this is a fossil. This fish is not eating, it's giving birth. It's a fish that died halfway through the act of giving birth. Right, millions of years. It just naturally died of old age, and then over millions of years it fossilised. I don't think so. That happened instantly. Right, here we go. What are these fossils of? Can anybody tell? The one on the right is more obvious. Those are jellyfish. Okay. Does a jellyfish have an external shell? No. Okay. Does it have an internal skeleton? No. Is there any part of its body that is not jelly? When one dies on the beach and then is washed up on the beach, roughly how long do you think it takes for that jellyfish carcass to rot away? Maybe 24 hours, maybe 48. Definitely if you come back in a week it will be all gone. Because it's all soft tissue and nothing else. It very, very quickly rots away. Okay? And yet, look at how well preserved. I mean, it's not even half rotted away. It's you shouldn't have fossilised jellyfish if it took even a week or 2 for those layers to form. There shouldn't be any fossilised jellyfish at all. And yet, I've picked out 4 examples. There are others from all over the place, all different places. Okay, next slide, please. Fossilised octopus. Does an octopus have an external hard shell? Does it have an internal skeleton? Is any part of its body hard? In fact, there is one part of its body that's hard, and that is the beak. It's so small you can't see it. It's a little triangular thing that's sort of where you would think the mouth would be. A little triangle of, I think it's very, very hard cartilage, something like that. Octopus, fascinating creature, very intelligent, but the brain is quite small, but that's because the rest of the brain appears to be, from what we can tell, spread out in its body. The legs actually have, it's kind of like the brain is partly contained in the legs, and if a leg gets cut off by a predator or something, the leg on its own will try and make its way back to the octopus. And there are loads of stories, if you look on the internet, of octopus doing things that just are unimaginable. In an aquarium, some janitor that the octopus takes a dislike to, and it squirts him, and then it'll be someone who goes off. I think there was one who went off on maternity leave and came back a year later, and the octopus remembered her and squirted her and still didn't like her. Right? And there's another story about another aquarium. I forget which one this was, but it might have been in Paris, but I might be wrong. And very rare, valuable fish in a tank that disappeared. It just was gone. They came in one morning and it was gone, and there were 1 or 2 little remnants left, and it had been eaten. And there was watermarks leading down the corridor and around the corner to where this tank was, and it was the octopus had got out. Now, the tank that the octopus was in was completely sealed off. The only way it could have got out was the pipe that goes in where the water pump is. So, and it got out through there. It squeezed itself practically flat as a pancake to go through a vent, because it's entirely made of jelly, it can contort itself all kinds of different ways. Got into the corridor, walked down the corridor and around the corner, and then got into the tank where this rare fish was, ate it, got back out again, walked round the corner and down the corridor, and then got back into its own tank. And when they came in the morning, this fish was gone, and there was the octopus looking all innocent in its own tank. This is the kind of things they can do. But again, they don't last long. The body rots, and it certainly wouldn't be preserved in as good condition as some of these fossils unless it had been killed instantly and covered instantly, buried instantly with pressure and not a lot of time. Bang, and then it's fossilised. Well, it obviously doesn't fossilise immediately, but it dies instantly is the point. Yes, next slide. This is a very interesting one. This was in Creation magazine, which exists in this country. I think you can subscribe to it. It's about every month or every 2 months. It's Protestant people who do it, but they do a very good job. This is a fossilised octopus where I think you can see the ink sac is still intact. And they actually had the dried hardened ink in it, which they scraped out. They put it into a jar here, and they put a little bit of water in it. Next slide. And they painted a picture of the octopus using the original ink from the octopus, which allegedly, so we are told, is millions and millions of years old ink. Now I ask you, is that ink really millions of years old? None of this makes any sense. But you'll notice that they don't bother trying to address it, they just pretend it doesn't exist, which is why most people aren't aware of fossilised jellyfish, most people aren't aware of fossilised octopus or polystrate fossils or any of that stuff, which just doesn't exist. Because then we can claim with our authority that we know scientifically millions of years. Okay, next slide. Right, this is a coin, I don't know if you can see it, the date on it here is 1744. It was a Dutch ship which sank off the coast of South Africa. You'll notice it's entirely encased in rock. So petrification and fossilisation does not take millions of years. There are loads of examples, and we could talk about it all day. I could fill hundreds of slides if I wanted to, but you can go and have a look on the internet of very fast petrification, very fast fossilisation. So that rock, that coin, is maybe 250, 270, 80 years old, and it's completely encased in rock. It didn't take millions of years to happen. Next slide, please. Right, this is fascinating. That very clearly is a nut and bolt to me, that's a screw. You'll notice it's entirely enclosed in rock. Somebody has cut away a square hole so you can see it better, but it's entirely enclosed in rock. This was found in Russia, and the hilarious thing about it is watching them try to get around this, trying to explain it away, because unfortunately this made the news media and then they had to explain it. So they've got two explanations. Next slide, please. There we go. This is ancientorigins.net. Is this a 300 million year old screw, or is it just a fossilised sea creature? The problem is the layer of rock it was found in was 300 million years old on the geological column. So that's a bit of a problem. We've now got a 300 million year old screw. So, first serious explanation, you've guessed it, aliens left it behind. And you'll find this all over. Second explanation, it's not really a screw, it's not really a nut and bolt at all, it's a sea creature. Does that look like a sea creature to you? I'll show you the sea creature that it's a, I'll even mention it here. It's in Russia, let's see, when they came across the strange object. In a layer of rock between 300 and 320 million years old. Okay, a 1-inch screw. Oh, so it's a sea creature which measures exactly 1 inch. It's a very human measurement for a sea creature. Oh, also, the aliens use inches apparently. Right, next slide, please. This is Daily Mail. There we go. Good old Daily Mail. Science and Tech. Is this a 300 million year old screw? But scientists say it's just a fossilised sea creature. You notice the one explanation, which never occurs to them for 1 second, is that they've got the age of the rock wrong. There's absolutely no way that could be the case. Next slide, please. Metro. I apologise for the multicolour. Yes. Could this 300 million year old screw be proof of aliens? People read this, and this is serious stuff apparently. This is what people read on the tube on the way into work. 300 million year old screw left by aliens, right, which happens to be 1 inch long. This is another one that was found in China this time. That's the actual bit of metal there with the screw thread. That's the kind of hollow that it left behind. It's not actually coal, it's rock. I don't know why it's black coloured. Next slide, please. That's the sea creature. Crinoid, is it that they call it? Now, I get it. There's a superficial resemblance because it has these sort of long things with little ridges on them, and kind of a tail thing there. But I mean, really, that's what we're being asked to believe. That screw, which is exactly 1 inch long, and even has a kind of hexagonal bolt end on it. Apparently, it's just one of these, part of it. Right. Next slide. Oh look, there's a fossilised hammer. Maybe the aliens left that behind as well. Or maybe that's really a sea creature and it just happens to look like a hammer. Right, next slide please. That's a petrified hat. It's a trilby. This one is very interesting. It was in a mine that closed down in the United States. So we know roughly how old it is. I think the mine closed, let me get this right, the mine closed in the 40s, 50s, and somebody went back in, I think, the 80s. So over the course, not very long, maybe 30 years maximum, somebody obviously left his hat behind, and the water dripped on it, and the water contained sediment, probably limestone sediment. And eventually what happens is the hat rots away, but the sediment that's gone into the material remains. So what you're left with is a stone hat. But it took a couple of decades to form. No more than that. Next slide, please. Partly fossilised revolver. Yeah, next slide. This is a Kent Hovind one, a fossilised pickle, where it was an abandoned house where they'd had jars of, pickle is just a gherkin, isn't it? And jars of gherkins, and the lid of one of them had rusted off, and the elements had turned it into stone. Between the 60s and I think the early 90s, so again 20 to 30 years maximum is how long that took. Next slide please. Right, the Lincoln Memorial in Washington DC. Now this was built between 1940 and 1922. I use this because not only does fossilisation and petrification take far less time than you're led to believe, stalagmites and stalactites is the same story. If you go on a guided tour of the caves in some part of the country, the tour guide will tell you, don't touch the stalactites. They're hundreds of millions of years old. They take millions of years to form. Next slide. These are stalactites underneath the Lincoln Memorial, which was built 100 years ago. Notice, by the way, that those two gentlemen are dressed. This is not a recent photograph. People don't wear bow ties and Homburg hats anymore the way that chap's dressed. Okay, so that's a photo taken in, I would guess, the 50s maybe. Maybe, again, maximum 30 years. So this can happen in a decade or two. Next slide, please. Okay. The coelacanth. Right. Now, here is Wikipedia. By the way, Wikipedia, in case you haven't guessed, is evangelically atheist. Right? It's more reliable on certain other topics, it really depends. But anything to do with geology, evolution, science versus creation, anything like that, don't expect even an attempt at a balanced opinion from them. They are evangelically atheist and evolutionists, so I'm quoting them as a hostile source. Coelacanths, which are related to lungfishes and tetrapods, were believed to have become extinct at the end of the Cretaceous period. On the 23rd of December 1938, the first Latimeria specimen was found off the coast of East Africa on the Chiluma River. Okay, its discovery 66 million years after its supposed extinction makes the coelacanth the best known example of a Lazarus taxon, an evolutionary line that seems to have disappeared from the fossil record only to reappear much later. Since 1938, West Indian Ocean coelacanth have been found in the Comoros, Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, Madagascar, someplace I can't pronounce, and off the south coast of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. Right, that's a very slimy and dishonest way of saying, oops, we got it wrong. By the way, 66 million years, they've already massaged the figures there. The coelacanth was an index fossil for 300 to 320 million years ago rock. The coelacanth was the index fossil for 300 million years, not 66. But even though they've massaged the figure down from 300 million years ago to 66 million years ago, it still doesn't help them. Supposedly, this was alive slightly before the dinosaurs, well, or about the same time as the dinosaurs, and has long ago become extinct, and it's now an index fossil. And oops, in 1938, somebody found one still swimming around, still alive. It's a Lazarus taxon. If you invent a fancy name for it, that kind of explains it away. So again, notice the one thing that never occurs to them is that the time scale is wrong. It has to be, oh, it's been alive for millions of years. Must be. They can't explain it. I think the reason that nobody noticed it, by the way, I'm told that coelacanth doesn't taste very nice. You can eat it, but it tastes of muddy water, so people aren't going to fish a lot of them, and there's not that many of them around. And if a fisherman drags up a net full of fish, unless you happen to be involved in geology or evolution or whatever, you wouldn't necessarily spot it, would you? So it makes you wonder how many more of these index fossils are still alive out there, and nobody necessarily is going to spot them. So yeah, there we go. An index fossil, 300 million years, still alive. A living fossil from eons past, 2020. That's 2019, November 2019, 3 years ago. That article. It's been swimming in our oceans for around 360 million years, is what it says in that article. Next slide, please. Okay, so fossils. We've done layers of rock, fossils, radiometric dating is the other thing that they prove the age of the Earth, and the way that this works is as follows. The sun's rays strike the atmosphere and certain carbon molecules are turned into carbon-14, but a very small percentage, and it's highly unstable, it's radioactive, and it breaks down. It has a half-life supposedly of, I think 5,700 years, is that right? Okay, and then of course plants take in carbon, animals take in carbon by breathing and by eating the plants, and we eat the animals that eat the plants, and we also eat the plants and we also breathe. Okay, and the body just counts it as carbon, doesn't matter whether it's carbon or carbon-14. Normal carbon is 12. Okay, so therefore there's a certain amount in the atmosphere, there's the same amount in the plants, there's the same amount in us. Therefore we can measure how much is missing and tell how old something is because it has a radioactive half-life. That's the theory. There's a number of problems with it. Right, next slide. It's another information management. So it's the sun's rays that create carbon-14 in the atmosphere, okay, in the upper atmosphere. Next slide. Same thing essentially. Is there anything if I haven't explained that properly, please ask. Is there anything that's in any way unclear about it or that we need to go into? Okay, next slide. All right, so let's say I think the proportion is something like 0.000075%. So therefore, in my body right now should also be 0.0000075% carbon-14. Therefore, if you find a dead body and it's got half that amount, you say, well, the half-life is 5,700 years, therefore these remains are 5,700 years old. That's how it's meant to work. Okay, next slide, please. There we go. And then a quarter of the amount means it's 11,000 and a half years old. An eighth, 17,000 years. 1/16th of the amount, 23,000 years. 1/32nd the amount, and so on. And then after that, not very much, because there's so little to begin with that by that point you can hardly measure it. Incidentally, even that will only take you to, 20,000, maybe if you were to double it, 50,000 years. And so, not millions of years. But anyway, all right, next slide. So the problem is this. You have to assume, we know how much is in the atmosphere now. How much was there in the atmosphere 2,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago? We don't know. You're measuring not how much there is present, how much carbon-14 is present. In effect, you're measuring how much is not present. Well, if you're going to measure the absence of something, you need to know how much there was to begin with. And the problem is, if the Earth were young, then the rate would be increasing. If you put a brand new Earth in front of a brand new sun, how much carbon-14 would be in the atmosphere? None at all. And the moment the sun's rays strike the atmosphere, it would start increasing, wouldn't it? The man who invented this, discovered this was after the Second World War, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and then there were various nuclear tests going on in the late 40s, early 50s, and that it was as a result of that. Okay, and they assumed there's a point called saturation point where the new carbon-14 being created in the upper atmosphere is equal to the amount decaying through half-life, and it doesn't increase anymore. A little bit like filling a barrel full of water with holes in the bottom. As you fill it up, the rate of it being filled up will decrease until you're putting in water at the same time that it's flowing out, and it stays level. Yes? Hello. So, saturation point, I think he calculated, is going to be after about 30,000 years we'll reach saturation point. Okay? Then he said, well, we know that the Earth is more than 30,000 years old, therefore we can just take that as read. We're going to assume that it's been at the saturation point for a long time. The problem is that was in the 50s. Now we know, I think there's a certain amount of evidence that the amount is still increasing, so that's a problem for them. If the Earth were young, you wouldn't expect to find as much carbon-14 in something from a few thousand years ago, would you? So in effect, it's circular reasoning. Because in order to prove that the Earth is old, you need to assume that the Earth is old, okay? And besides which, I mean, people get stuck on the fact that carbon-14 is wildly inaccurate, and it is inaccurate, but that's not the main point. The main point about it is the concept itself is flawed. You're measuring what's not there. You're measuring how much is missing from an amount that you don't know to begin with. That's not scientific. You have to guess how much was there to begin with, and then you can begin to measure how much is now missing today. It's not scientific. It's just too big an assumption. Okay. All right. Next slide, please. So this is Dr. Willard Libby who invented it. These are his assumptions. How much was in the Earth's atmosphere? Has it reached the point of equilibrium, saturation yet? Yes, and too long ago to matter are his assumptions. Was carbon-14 present in the Earth's atmosphere thousands of years ago and the same amount as today? Yes, you have to assume that or it doesn't work. Is the rate of decay of carbon-14 uniform? Yes. Well, it might be, but we don't know, and you have to assume that or it doesn't work. Is there no other way that it can decrease? Can it be washed out? Again, you have to assume that there is no other way that it can decrease, and again, we don't know that for certain. Okay? But all of those things are variables you have to assume or it just doesn't work. Next slide, please. So, this is the Kent Hovind analogy. Right, Kent Hovind, if you watch one of his videos, explains this as only he can explain it. He says, imagine that you walk into a room and there's a candle burning on the table. It's a lighted candle. There's nobody in the room, but that candle is lit. And I say to you, how long has that candle been burning for? Well, it's an impossible question to answer, isn't it? Because I don't know. When was it lit? Tell me when it was lit. Tell me how long it's been burning. Well, I can measure the candle and I can say, well, it's 6 inches tall. Great. That's scientific. Wonderful. I can measure the rate of burn and I can say, well, it's burning down 1 inch every hour. That's great. But when was it lit? Well, I mean, that depends how tall it was to begin with, and we don't know how tall it was. How much was there to begin with? How much was already missing by the time I entered the room? We don't know that. Also, are there any other factors, like if you open the window and let the air in and the flame flickers a lot, that's going to burn a lot faster, isn't it? And we don't know that. But this is in effect what's going on with carbon dating. Not scientific. Too many assumptions. The concept is seriously flawed. Next slide, please. This is a famous example of a woolly mammoth that was discovered, and they carbon dated it, and one part of it was 29,500 years old, the other part was 44,000 years old. It's the same animal. Doesn't work. This is nearly 100% margin of error for the same animal. Next slide. Okay, the shells of living mollusks in the 60s were dated, and they were 23,000 years old allegedly, even though they were still alive. Shells from living snails were carbon dated as 27,000 years old in the 1980s. Right, this is 30 years after they'd been doing this, and they're still getting it wildly wrong. Next slide. Freshly killed seal dated as having died 1,300 years old. This is the official explanation. Talk Origins is just dreadful. I mean, it's just an evolution apologetic website, really. But their explanation is, oh yes, it's because it was the Arctic seawater, and carbon-14 doesn't behave the same way in Arctic seawater. Well, okay, for argument's sake, let's accept that. What you're saying, in effect, is we know why it got it wrong. Well, if that's the case, how do you know it hasn't got it wrong in other areas that you're later going to find out? How can you ever know that it's got it right if that's the case? Yeah. Next slide, please. This is a very famous thing. This is the is this the tuff? Homo erectus was thought to have vanished some 250,000 years ago, but even though he used two different dating methods, Swisher kept making the same starting find. Bones were 53,000 years old at most, and possibly no more than 27,000 years old, a stretch of time contemporaneous with modern. Oh, right, no, this is Leslie Cowden from Newsweek. Right, next slide. There we go. So here, that's a 96% margin of error. It's either 53,000 years old or 27,000 years old. Well, if you have a nearly 100% margin of error, what is the point? How scientific is that? And by the way, both of them are probably wrong, for the reasons I've just explained above. Next slide, please. This is from the proceedings of the 12th Nobel Symposium in New York. So, fairly serious people, you would think. They say, if a carbon-14 date supports our theories, we put it in the main text. If it does not entirely contradict them, we put it in a footnote, and if it's completely out of date, we just drop it. Well, I'm sorry, that's not honest, is it? That's just not honest. But most people won't be aware of that. Next slide, please. Right, this is the KBS stuff. Okay. K. Bremensmeyer, I think, is the name of the person who first discovered this. So KBS just stands for K. Bremensmeyer site, and tuff is this kind of layer of, I think it's ash in East Africa. Excuse me, this is Wikipedia today saying, oh, it occurred approximately 1.87 million years ago. Well, that's not entirely honest, we'll come back to that. Between 1970 and 1985, the age of the tuff was the subject of intense academic dispute. They're not telling you what that dispute was, notice, they're just saying there was a dispute, with a variety of dates proposed. This dispute came to be known as the KBS tuff controversy, and in the whole rest of that article, they never explain what the dispute was. But it's hilarious. Next slide, please. So, it originally, in 1970, they used potassium-argon dating, which is a similar in theory to carbon dating, because you have a radioactive thing, it breaks down, but one thing turns into another, and it has a half-life. But potassium-argon dating, there's other ones, lead, uranium. Carbon dating can only work on carbon, so when you're talking about rock, you need to use something like lead, uranium, or potassium-argon. But it's even more inaccurate than carbon dating, and the concept is flawed for the same reason. You don't know how much there was to begin with, and you're measuring how much is missing. So this layer, this KBS tuff, this layer of, I think, fossilised ash or something in East Africa, they dated it as 212 to 230 million years old in 1970. In 1972, a human skull was found underneath that 212 million years old layer. Oops, oh dear, we've got a problem now. So they took it away for carbon dating. Oh, it's 2.9 million years old. Well, that can't be right, because human beings only began 250,000 years ago, as we know from the geological column. So they sent 10 different samples away to 10 different laboratories, and they got answers ranging from 500,000 to 2.64 million. Well, that's a margin of error of 500%, more or less. It's all nonsense. Next slide, please. Okay. Here are some examples of potassium-argon dating, where we know that dating the layers of rocks using radiometric dating just does not work, because there are volcanic eruptions and we see new layers of rock being formed, brand new. So we know how old they are. I already mentioned Mount St. Helens in the top left corner of the USA in Washington State. But you have Mount Etna in Sicily, Pompeii, Mount Vesuvius we know is about 2,000 years old, Mount Etna in the 1970s. St. Helens in Washington, I mentioned that's about 40 odd years ago. Okay, Hawaii, 1959, we know how old those layers of rocks are. People observed them being laid down, and every single time they try to use this method on them, it comes up with results that aren't just wrong, they're wildly wrong, they're not even close. brand new layers of rock that we saw forming, and it'll say 500 million years old. Well, at that point, you just have to throw that method out because it clearly doesn't work. It's not even close. Next slide, please. Yeah, same thing. Yeah. When an object of known age is dated using radiometric dating, the results are totally unreliable and frequently wrong, and sometimes, usually by a very, very wide margin. But, next slide. Whenever an object of unknown age is dated using radiometric dating, the results are assumed to be totally accurate. Again, is that scientific? No, it is not. Next slide, please. Right, so there we go. That's the three main things that give us the age of the Earth. The geological column, fossils and radiometric dating. Next. All wrong. Next, please. Okay. Evidence against an old Earth. Next slide. So, let me just go back one and introduce this properly. Previous. Yeah. Oh, you know what? Just leave it. It's fine. I think evidence against an old Earth, if you want to say the Earth is young, and it is young, there's no question about it, it's roughly 6,000 years ago, I think here I would say you need to find something that can't be that old. Okay, it's a little bit like if you found a treasure chest buried in the ground, let's say it's on a ship that sank, a Spanish treasure galleon, you look inside the chest and there are loads of coins and there are dates on the coins, a little bit like the one I showed you earlier on, yes? Now I might say to you, when did that ship sink? Well, I don't know. Okay, can you put a time limit on it? It can be no older than this. And in fact, if you look at the date on a coin, it can't be, it can't have sunk before the coin was minted, can it? So if the coin says 1650, it must have sunk after 1650. Does everybody follow me, yes? Mm-hmm. Okay. If you find all the coins minted with the date 1650, but there's one coin that says 1699, well then it must have sunk after 1699. Even though it's only one coin, that's a limiting factor. That's what we mean by a limiting factor. There only has to be one, and that's it. That just draws an absolute line under it. Yes, do we all agree? Okay. Now that means you probably would say 1699 on the coin. The ship must have sunk in the early 1700s. But you don't know that. All you know is it's no older than that. You don't know that it's not radically younger. Maybe there's an eccentric Texas oil millionaire whose hobby is building replica Spanish galleons from the 1600s and filling them with replica coins, and unfortunately it sank in the 1990s, right? And that would be completely consistent. Maybe he's a collector of old coins or something. So it might be a lot more recent, but it can't be any older than that, yes? Right, what I'm going to show you now then are limiting factors. Next slide, please. So, the amount of sediment on the sea floor, it accumulates, we know that, it builds up over time. If it had been building up over time for 3 or 4 billion years, then it would have to be miles deep of sediment. And it just isn't. There's not enough sediment on the sea floor for the Earth to be billions of years old. I'm not aware of any explanation which gets them out of that problem. Okay? Next slide, please. The amount of salt water in the sea. Fascinating. Why is the sea salty? When the streams flow into the rivers, and the rivers flow into the oceans. Now, there's two types of salt for us today. There's rock salt and there's sea salt, right? In fact, they're the same thing. The rock salt is carried in by the river into the ocean. The water evaporates. Well, when you have water evaporating, it leaves the salt behind, doesn't it? When you have water evaporating, you just get pure water. But what it leaves behind is going to be there's going to be less water, and therefore there's going to be a higher salt concentration. So that's happening over time. The amount of salt in the oceans is accumulating. Very interesting as well. You get saltwater fish and freshwater fish, saltwater crocodiles and freshwater crocodiles. There's been a lot of experiments by people who do these things where they keep them in tanks. They'll take a freshwater animal, keep it in a tank of fresh water, and just add a little bit of salt over time, and it gets used to it, and by the end of its life it's become a saltwater version. And they can do the same thing the other way around. They put saltwater fish in a saltwater tank and they gradually lower the salt content, and it turns into a freshwater fish. It gets used to it. That's why you have two varieties of both. Originally, at the time of the flood, there would have been no salt in the oceans. All the world's oceans would have been just water. The salt has been accumulating over time, okay, because of the process of evaporation and so on. Now, there's not enough in there for it to be even 1 billion years old, or even half a billion years old. It would be way more salty than it is now. And people argue about the exact figure, the calculations, but we're talking, it's not even close. It's not even a fraction of the time. The oceans to be as salty as they are, it can't even be, it's probably not even 1 million years old. I forget what the exact calculation is. Okay. Have I explained that properly? Any questions? All right, next slide, please. Comets. There's lots more from outer space I could talk about here, different planets that have magnetic cores, and they shouldn't because magnetism runs down over time. Anyway, but a comet is really simple to remember because a comet is mostly ice, I think. Does it even have like a little pebble in the centre of it, or is it solidly ice? I don't know. Anyway, the point is, you don't see a comet. The only reason we see it is because as it goes past the sun, that ice doesn't just turn into liquid, it goes into gas, it burns off, and that's why it has a tail. That's the only reason it's visible to us. Well, now clearly, even if it's in a very, very, very elliptical orbit with the sun at one end, and comes back once in a very long time, you've not got an infinite amount of ice, have you? So eventually that ice is going to be gone, and it won't take billions of years. So why are there still comets? They should all have gone by now, they should be long gone. Comets should be a phenomena that happens early on, and then the ice burns off and then they're gone. And if we're at the end of a very old universe, a very old solar system, a very old Earth and Sun, there shouldn't be any comets on it. Okay?
So what's the explanation for the creation of comets?
Sorry?
How did comets come about in the first place?
Oh, I don't actually know.
Okay.
But they're there. They're just lumps of ice, really, floating around. Yeah. But yeah, so if we're in a 4.65 billion year old Earth, how can there still be comets? And the answer, I mean, there are comets that we know of, or that we knew of before, that now no longer exist because the ice is all gone, it's all burnt off. They came up with, the chap was called Van Oort, I think, and he said, oh yes, there's an infinite comet generator, just beyond the reach of what we can see and detect. How convenient. Like dark matter and dark energy. The evidence for its existence is that we're in real trouble if it doesn't exist. Therefore it must exist. No one has ever seen it, no one has ever detected it, but it must be there. So it's an Oort cloud, it's an infinite comet generator. It's like a solid wall of ice that just throws new comets out every once in a while. And that's how they're still appearing after billions of years. Absolute nonsense, science fiction, and not very sound reasoning either. Right, next slide please. Okay, soft tissue in dinosaur bones. Most people have never heard of this, even though it was really the discovery of the century. These 65 million year old fossilised bones, I think somebody accidentally dropped one on the floor of the lab and it broke open and there was soft tissue inside, and not only that, there's red blood cells inside. So is it really 65 million years old? And the answer is no, it can't possibly be that old. It cannot possibly be that old. And it's done the rounds. Mary Schweitzer was the scientist who discovered it. That's Scientific American from December 2010, but I mean it still really hasn't made its way into the mainstream media. But this is a little bit what I was talking about before. Intramurally in the so-called scientific community, they're a lot more honest with each other, but when they're talking to us plebs, they put on a completely different face, and they don't allow a lot of this embarrassing stuff to get out.
Why could the red blood cells be in it if it was millions of years old?
Because they won't last that long.
So it's just like...
It's organic matter,
yeah.
It decays over time. Organic matter doesn't, it'll rot away, or I guess it's microbes that act on it, something like that. Is that what causes decay in flesh?
Yeah.
Something like that, yeah. It doesn't last.
Where was it found though? Because I mean that, wow.
The original bone, I would imagine North America,
Yeah.
I think,
I mean,
because it was a
so
North
not in
American.
ice there.
Sorry?
In ice or?
No, it was
Yeah.
fossilised on the outside. That's why they thought it was a fossil. So it had partially turned to stone, and they assumed it was stone all the way through. It had begun to petrify, but on the inside it hadn't yet.
Because you can find like a lamb bone or something from a couple hundred years ago, literally bone dry.
Yeah.
Does that suggest that it's not even thousands of years old, but perhaps only hundreds?
Yes. Well, that's right. Yeah. Yeah, that's a very good question. Actually, it's a very good question. I don't actually know. I mean, maybe it is only fairly recent, or maybe it's a bit older than that. Maybe it was, yeah, I honestly don't know, but I don't think it was frozen. There are frozen, I mean the mammoth I showed you earlier on, I mean they've been gone for a fair old while, and they find them all the time up in the North Pole, in the Arctic Circle, with the undigested contents of the stomach, and it's fresh green grass and leaves, which suggests there was green vegetation up at the North Pole a while ago. There's a whole other world before the flood. And again, because it's the flood, and because the flood is in the Bible, it can't possibly be true, so therefore we pretend we haven't seen it, is the answer. But yeah, this is a whole rabbit hole that it's worth going down. There is loads of stuff out there if you know what to look for. I haven't included it in here. I just simply mention it as a limiting factor, that things can't be that old. Right, next slide please. The moon is moving away from the Earth. It's an inch and a half every year. It gets slightly further away. You do the calculation, if we've been here for billions of years, the moon would have been much closer. And they've tried to get around it by saying, well, gravity, the further away it gets, the faster it moves, so maybe it wasn't that close, but okay. But the problem is the moon affects the tides. So even if it were a little bit close, I think it's, even if it were a little bit closer, you'd have tides that would make life on Earth just absolutely impossible. Things wouldn't work if the moon were even slightly closer. Next slide, please. The Earth's magnetic field is running down. The gentleman who discovered this, by the way, is a scientist called Thomas Barnes. I remember that name because there was a boy in my class at school called Thomas Barnes. In fact, he was the captain of the rugby team. Not the same guy. But he discovered it, and it converted him to being a creationist from being an evolutionist. Just this one fact. Because he said the Earth can't possibly be that old. 20,000 years at most. Okay. Yeah, this. Yeah. If you've done 2 in 1, I think that's it. Yeah. So there we go. That's it. Essentially. There's a few other things I just threw in there just to think about. The oldest literature in the world is maybe 3,000 years. Maybe 3,000 years old. Oldest trees in the world are maybe 4,000 years old, something like that. Human population, yeah, it's a parabolic, it's a curve that goes upwards, particularly after the Industrial Revolution. But if you work the human population backwards and look at what the population was in the whole world, it's pretty clear that it goes back to a few thousand years ago with, well, not just Adam and Eve, in fact it would have come through Noah and his 3 sons. But it definitely is not 250,000 years worth of human population. Otherwise, the population of Earth would be much higher than it is. And in fact, hundreds or even thousands of years ago, it would have actually been much higher than it is, unless you say that it stayed exactly the same for 246 of those 250,000 years, and then it went up. This doesn't really make any sense, I think. Okay, and there are a few other things as well. I've mentioned a few of them. There are other ones. That's essentially it. I didn't finish the last slide with the comparison of the ages because I just didn't get around to finishing it. I didn't have time. But that's the age of the Earth, and I think if you can prove scientifically that it's a young Earth, that just solves all of these problems, and it means they haven't got their magic powder to sprinkle on their alchemy, that a rock turned into an animal. Well, maybe if we wait millions of years it would happen. Well, there aren't millions of years for you to... That's the only reason that they have that time scale, by the way, is to make that possible, to make you believe it. It's not possible with time or without time. But they need it for that reason. Right. Part 1A. Part 1B is, I think, we'd have a look at macroevolution and things changing and so forth. Okay? But I think I need a break first of all, certainly, in a few things, so I think we'll leave it there for the moment.